Long ago, the slave ship Onukochi left the coast of West Africa, carrying its cargo of chainsaws bound for the colonies. The ship was a feared iron beast of the sea, its name whispered in dread by the coastal villagers who had long seen its dark shadow come to take their kin. Yet this time, the Onukochi carried something more than despair and broken lives. Unbeknownst to its crew, a gift had been placed aboard, one that would turn their journey into a nightmare. Before the ship set sail, Captain Amos, a hard-faced Englishman with salt in his veins and a reputation for cold cruelty, walked the bustling docks. His sharp gaze swept across the slaves being dragged aboard, hundreds of men, women, and children. Among them was Kelechi, a captured warrior who towered above the others. There was a defiance in his eyes that caught Amos's attention, a strength unbroken by captivity. Amos had seen Kelechi before. Weeks earlier, during a coastal raid, the warrior had fought fiercely with a spear, holding off several attackers before he was finally subdued. His spirit had not been crushed even as the shackles were clamped around his wrist, and it had stayed with Amos, festering in the back of his mind. Now, as preparations were being made to leave, Amos witnessed something that made that memory come rushing back. A young cabin boy, clumsy and inexperienced, had been struggling with a rope tethering a large wooden crate, a mysterious box that had arrived at the dock just that morning. The crate wobbled as the boy lost his grip, the frayed rope snapping, sending the massive box tumbling toward the boy. The dock hands barely had time to shout a warning. But before the crate could crush him, Kelechi lunged forward with astonishing speed. His hands closed around the boy's collar, yanking him back just as the box crashed onto the dock with a thunderous boom. Splinters flew, the carvings on the box briefly flaring as if alive. Amos stood nearby, watching, intrigued by the display of strength. He approached, boots echoing ominously against the wooden planks. Kelechi released the boy, who stumbled away, his face pale with terror. For a moment, Amos said nothing. His eyes, cold as the northern sea, fixed on Kelechi's. "You've saved one of mine today," he said, his voice a low growl, "but don't think that changes your fate." Kelechi met his gaze with silent defiance. There was a brief, unspoken acknowledgement between the two men, a shared understanding that this encounter was not the last. The day after the near accident, as the Onukochi prepared to depart, Amos was approached by an old man from the village, his face weathered and lined like the bark of an ancient tree. His eyes glimmered with a knowledge beyond the understanding of ordinary men. "I bring a gift," the old man rasped, his voice thick with the weight of something ancient. In his hands, he held the very box that had nearly crushed the cabin boy, a large wooden crate bound in iron chains, covered in strange carvings that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. "This is not to be opened," the old man said, his eyes locking with Amos's, "until you reach American shores. What it holds is not for your journey." Amos, ever the skeptic, scoffed at the man's warning. "Superstitions," he muttered, but something about the old man's gaze unsettled him. He ordered the box stowed below deck, out of sight and away from the prying eyes of his men. The chains that bound it rattled like the whispers of forgotten gods. 3 days into the voyage, the first sign of trouble appeared. A cabin boy, no more than 14, was found dead in the galley, his body torn apart. His skin had been shredded by something more vicious than any weapon. The crew assumed it was an animal that had stowed away from the shore, perhaps a wild dog. But they found no creature aboard. Captain Amos dismissed the talk of curses, but the tension among the crew thickened like a heavy fog. The slaves below deck, hundreds of men, women, and children, sat in chains, whispering prayers to gods the crew didn't understand. Among them was Kelechi, a warrior captured from his village. His eyes, sharp and observant, caught the fear in the crew's movements, and he noticed something strange. the box had started to make soft clicking sounds at night. The second night brought more death. This time, it was the first mate, Harper, a seasoned sailor with a reputation for cruelty. His body was found hanging from the rigging, his throat slashed open, his eyes wide in terror. Blood dripped from the sails as if the ship itself had started to bleed. Panic spread among the crew. The whispers grew louder. Was there something hidden among the slaves? Or had the box cursed them all? Captain Amos ordered the slaves searched, convinced one of them was responsible. Kelechi watched the crew descend into paranoia. The slaves were innocent, their chains too tight for any of them to move freely at night. But the crew, desperate for an explanation, lashed out, beating anyone who moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. But something far darker was at play. Kelechi knew there was a beast among them, yet no one knew where it lurked. As the deaths continued, the box became a source of obsession for the crew. They began to believe that opening it might stop the killings, that perhaps it contained something powerful enough to save them from whatever stalked them in the dark. But Captain Amos was determined to follow the old man's instructions. "Not until we reach America," he barked, though the strain in his voice was evident. That night, Kelechi lay below deck with the other captives. The chains rattled softly in the darkness, a reminder of their fate. But the real terror was not in their captivity, it was in the air, thick, electric, and laced with something ancient. Kelechi couldn't sleep. The soft clicking from the box had grown louder. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night. Kelechi's eyes shot open as footsteps thundered above deck. The slaves whispered in fear, but the sound of gunfire cut through their murmurs. Kelechi strained, trying to see what was happening. More shouts, more gunfire. Then silence. By morning, 4 more men were dead. Each had been mutilated beyond recognition, their limbs twisted in ways no human hands could manage. The remaining crew huddled together, terror in their eyes. They began to suspect each other. No one was safe, and everyone was a suspect. Is the beast one of us? The men began to wonder. Captain Amos, now driven half mad, kept his hand on the hilt of his sword at all times. The crew's numbers were dwindling, and soon there wouldn't be enough men left to sail the ship. Kelechi remained silent but alert. He had seen things no one else had. He knew the beast did not hide among the slaves, it was something far older, something that didn't belong in the world of men. But who, or what, it was, remained unclear. He watched the crew tear themselves apart, their suspicion growing like a poison. As the Onikochi drifted further into the Atlantic, the men began to hear things. Whispered voices in the dead of night, low growls beneath the deck, the sound of chains dragging when no one was there. Fear gnawed at their minds, turning them against each other. The crew started locking themselves in their quarters, refusing to stand watch alone. Even Captain Amos began to crumble. But Kelechi knew that hiding would not save them. Whatever this thing was, it was growing stronger with each night. The crew could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare, and every dark corner of the ship seemed to hide something waiting to strike. And the box clicked louder now, as if counting down to something. Finally, Captain Amos decided the time had come to open the box. In the dead of night, with the remaining crew gathered around, Captain Amos and Kelechi stood before the box. Its chains were rusted and ancient, the carvings along its surface pulsing faintly under the moonlight. With trembling hands, Amos undid the iron locks. The crew held their breath. Kelechi, though bound, felt a deep dread rise within him, as if every fiber of his being screamed against what was about to happen. The lid creaked open. Inside was nothing but a simple bone, long, thin, and cracked with age. Carved into its surface were strange symbols, indecipherable to anyone aboard. The crew stared in disbelief. All that death, for this? But Kelechi saw it for what it was. The bone was not a relic. It was a key. And the box had never been meant to hold anything, it was meant to summon something. A low growl echoed from the shadows. The air grew thick and heavy, and the crew's faces turned pale as they realized their mistake. The real horror had not been trapped inside the box. It had been walking among them all along, hidden in plain sight. Suddenly, one of the crew members, a quiet, unassuming man, collapsed to the floor, writhing in pain. His skin began to stretch, his bones cracking under the force of something growing within him. His eyes turned a sickly yellow as his body twisted and contorted. The beast had been among them the whole time, wearing a human face, waiting for the moment to reveal itself. The men screamed as Reed transformed into the creature they had feared, a thing of nightmares, with long claws, a twisted spine, and teeth sharp enough to tear through flesh like paper. Chaos erupted aboard the Onikochi. The beast tore through the crew with savage fury, its hunger insatiable. Captain Amos swung his sword in a blind rage, but the blade barely scratched the creature's hide. One by one, the men fell, their blood soaking the wooden deck. Kelechi watched in horror as the beast ravaged the ship. He knew there was no stopping it. Even if they made it to land, the curse would follow. The beast was no man, no mere mortal, it was a force beyond understanding, something ancient and unstoppable. As the ship creaked and groaned under the weight of its destruction, Kelechi closed his eyes, praying to the gods for a swift end. But the beast was not finished. It prowled through the wreckage, its eyes scanning the survivors, its hunger far from sated. Captain Amos, bleeding and broken, crawled toward the box, his final hope shattered. The last thing he saw was the beast's gaping maw descending upon him. By dawn, the Onikochi was silent, drifting aimlessly through the sea. The crew was gone, their bodies lost to the waves. Only Kelechi remained, and alone, the bone still sitting in the open box. As the sun rose, Kelechi understood the truth. The beast was not one man, it was all of them. Each night, it wore a different face. Each night, it chose a new victim to possess, to wear like a mask until there was no one left. And now, as the ship sailed toward an unknown horizon, Kelechi waited. He knew that when night fell again, the beast would come. And this time, it might wear his face.